Okay, so moving on from last week's real-world lighting scenario where we created a simple studio headshot, we're going to stay in the same place, same model, pretty much the same equipment, and create a very, very moody portrait. Now, this is nearly the end of the Learning to Light course, a free weekly course I've been putting together on YouTube. If you like what you're seeing, hit like, subscribe to get notifications. If you've got any questions, please stick them in the comments below. Meanwhile, let's head over to the studio. We're still in the studio with Lisa, the same camera, and 3 Profoto lights. But this time I want to show you how controlling the fall of light can create a dramatically different mood while still using the same space. Here's our setup. And here's the now standard automatic straight out of the camera image. As before, the white balance is off as it's lit by tungsten light and the camera is set for flash. There's no definition to the light at all, and since the exposure was 1/5 of the second at f2.8, we know there's a big risk of movement and blur in the shot. Now, as with the headshot earlier, we could of course adjust our exposure and white balance setting to correct some of this, but it won't change what is effectively a flat shot. It's not going to change the lighting. Let's try and create something more like this. Now compare this with the final image from the headshot, and there's quite a difference. Yet we've not changed location or put up a dark background. All we've done, as you'll soon see, is carefully control where the light falls. Now this time, I won't need to go into quite so much detail as we build the shot up, which I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. The first step we need to take is to change our exposure to manual and adjust it until the room looks black. I'm going for 1/250th of a second shutter speed, aperture of f6.3 and ISO 100. And lo and behold, that gives me a black frame. How very exciting. Now, as an aside, this is actually quite a useful trick to employ when shooting in a situation where you want to control the light very precisely. If you start from a blank slate black frame, you know that the only light in the final image will be light that you add. So I find it very helpful from time to time. Now, perhaps don't show the model or a client you might be working with, as they may think you've got no idea what you're doing or that you've left the lens cap on. Next, obviously, we need to turn a flash on. Now, as before, I'm using my swanky radio trigger, and let's start with the same softbox and flash we used last time as our key light, only this time I'm going to add a grid to the front of the softbox. Cast your mind back to what various modifiers do, and you'll remember that adding a grid to a light limits where it can fall. What it doesn't actually do is change the quality of the light itself. And since this softbox is still fairly large in relation to Lisa, it's still a soft light, just with a much more narrow beam being cast. You can see how just angling the softbox with a grid attached means that we very quickly can't see any of the light it casts. If you recall, this is known as feathering, and it's key to the look we're trying to create. Think back, and something placed dead center in the path of a light source will receive the most light, and then the amount will decrease as something is placed off to one side. Grids accentuate this effect, and if we're careful about where we angle our lights, we can control the fall of light quite precisely. For example, this softbox is off to one side of Lisa and aiming back at her, but none of it is aiming towards the back wall. If we went and stood at the back wall in the section of it which is visible behind and around Lisa, then looked towards the softbox, we wouldn't see any light coming from it. This, in combination with good old inverse square law, explains why we've turned a white wall into a dark grey, almost black one. Now look closely at the back wall and you can see it's faintly brighter on the left-hand side than the right. This is because this side of the wall will be just affected by any light being cast by the softbox. Not enough to make it bright, but enough to lift it just a little. If we wanted to darken this down further, we could flag the light in some way to prevent it from hitting the back wall at all, or place some large black reflectors around the back wall to shade it further. By now, you shouldn't need me to tell you that the other reason the back wall is so dark is because of inverse square law. Since we're exposed for Lisa, actually a little underexposed, but that suits the mood of the shot, and the back wall is quite a way behind her, it will be a good few stops darker than she is. We could accentuate this even further if we brought the softbox closer into her and therefore increased the relative distance between it, her and the back wall. Let's bring in 2 backlights to lift Lisa from the background and give her some definition and depth. I've placed these very carefully, as although they're doing a similar job to the backlight we added in our headshot earlier, all I really want them to do is outline Lisa, not interfere with the light falling on her front. If they come too far around to the side, they'll start to cast shadows I don't want. I've adjusted their power to give me a very similar amount of light to the headshot image, bright but not blown out, as you can see from this close-up. The effect is more marked in this image because the background is darker. The quality of these backlights is different to the headshot too. I want a soft light, as I'm wary of casting harsh shadows. But of course I also want to control very precisely where the light falls. I've chosen to use Softbox Modifiers on these backlights, but narrow ones known as strips. These give me just the right quality and spread enough to light from waist up to head, but they don't spill around in all directions. Once I've added a grid to each of them, I can control the fall of light even more. Let me pause for a minute and talk a little bit more about grids. We know that they're used to control the fall of light, and that they can be metal ones that pop into the front of a reflector, or fabric ones that fit into a softbox like this. Whichever format they take, one thing that is very often overlooked is that they have quite an effect on quantity of light. Something that I struggle with for ages, and I hope you don't get stuck on this yourselves, is that on first glance, adding a grid and channeling the light down into a narrower beam would lead you to think that the quantity of light will increase, but in fact the opposite is the case. When we add a grid to the front of a light, what we're basically doing is blocking off portions of it so not as much reaches our subject. You can see what I mean in this beautifully drawn diagram. The black sections of a grid won't be as thick as this, but the principle is the same. Anyway, back to controlling light in this shot. Since we're trying to keep a very tight rein on where the light goes, it's as important to check behind the light as it is to work on the front. Part of the reason I chose strip softboxes rather than, say, an umbrella is the ability to keep all the light in one direction. Imagine if instead of softboxes, these 2 backlights had umbrella modifiers on. The light from them would be spilling in all directions, and our back wall would probably get quite bright. When you assemble a softbox, they come with a little black collar called a back baffle, which you can wrap around the light housing. Unless you want light to fly off in all directions, make sure you seal this up, and then ensure it's nice and tight all the way around. You can see Jake here checking there's no light leaking from the back of this strip. If there was, it will project onto the back wall and cause distracting highlights. An image like this is a good time to talk about another aspect of lighting. Matching your lighting to your subject and being sympathetic to them. Now what we've achieved in this shot looks pretty good and dramatic. Lots of dark mood, deep shadows and contrasting highlights. With a professional model like Lisa in front of the camera, the shot works well. But beware using light that's this precise and has such a large range from shadow to highlight. Look what happens if Lisa turns her body a few degrees away from the key light. Suddenly we've lost almost half of her face. Now again, with a professional model like this, it still works as a shot. But you need to be conscious that the more precise your lighting setup is, in this case we've tightly controlled the light spill to give us this low-key mood, the less room your subject will have to move around. This may not be an issue, or it might be a major stumbling block. Just to pick one example, if you were trying to use a setup like this to take pictures of children, you may struggle, as they are not likely to sit still for very long, and will very soon run into areas where they're in pitch dark shadow. Here's a technique that can help, not just in lighting situations like this, but any lighting situation. Always try and look at the light from the subject's point of view. I don't mean in a philosophical sense, I mean physically. Get in there and look back at your various lights from the subject's position. A professional model will likely be able to tell you quite a bit about the lighting, and you can ask them to let you know if a certain light is missing them or shining right in their face. If you're going in yourself, do please be polite and respect the subject's personal space, particularly if you don't know them very well. Viewing the light from where the subject is can be crucial, as you'll be far better able to tell exactly where each light is falling. It can be very deceptive just looking from the camera and assuming that a certain light is doing a certain job, and this problem gets more acute the more precise the fall of each light. Imagine how tight the beam of light will be from a small gridded light, and you'll appreciate the importance of making sure it really is hitting the part of the shot you want. So we've taken the same location, the same 3 flashes, and with careful employment of distance, direction, and the use of some modifiers, we've created a totally different look. We've learnt how grids consume light, how important it is to control the spill from lights, and why it's important to look back at your light from the subject's point of view. Yes, I've used some swanky modifiers and expensive ProPhoto flash, but you could achieve something similar with considerably less kit. You just need to be very careful about where the light falls. Okay, we're all done here in the studio. Let's head outside and start to mix light up. Okay, so that demonstrates how exactly the same situation with a few changes can create quite a dramatically different result. Next week, another real-world scenario where we mix flash with ambient daylight. I'll see you soon.